Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. My name is HarveyBracken-Smith, and today I'm honoured to be joined by Alex Edmans. Alex is a professor of finance at London Business School. He's a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright Scholar and was previously a tenured professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. I'm incredibly excited to speak to Alex. We've already had a conversation before the podcast on many things that were podcast worthy, so I know this is going to be one well worth your listen. Alex actually completed Hyrox yesterday, being the #1 fundraiser for Macmillan. I would have normally gone straight into the start of his career in academia, but I think it'd be interesting and it's imperative to mention his great efforts. So, Alex, well done on the fundraiser yesterday. How was the Hyrox?
Well, first, thanks so much, Harvey, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So it was really grueling, but really fun. So often when you hear about these endurance events, you think, oh, let me just gut through it and I want to finish it. And once I finish, I can get the medal and post it on my Instagram. But the actual event is really exciting to do. So technically it's a race and you get your position versus all the other men within a certain age group yesterday, but it's not a race. You're not really competing against each other, you're competing against your own goals, and it's a festival. It's a celebration of all the things that your body can do. It's a celebration of all the different causes that people are running for. So I was running for a cancer charity, others might have been running for different charities, and most will have been running for no, but just because they want to push themselves mentally and physically, they wanted their family and friends to support them. So it was a fantastic festival yesterday.
And was there like a specific reason why you wanted to raise for Macmillan?
Yeah, so my dad sadly passed away with cancer when I was in university. And during his final few months, he was looked after by a Macmillan nurse. So obviously the main cancer charities are cancer research. And as a professor, I understand the value of research. And certainly research charities are really important. My first ever race was with Cancer Research UK. But support for current people with cancer is something which doesn't get as much attention. And while research will benefit people who have cancer in the future, what is there to benefit people who are suffering from cancer right now? There's 3 million cancer patients in the UK at the moment, and that's what Macmillan does. So I first started by doing the London Marathon in 2003. So I was a second-year analyst in investment banking. So if any listeners know this career, you were working all the time, and in any free time, you should be sleeping. But I really wanted to do this marathon, and you just find the time. And I was working with a great boss at the time, a guy called William Chalmers, who's now the CFO of Lloyd's. He also ran the London Marathon himself for a different charity, and so he would know that if in the weekends I need to go for a 3-hour run, then I can do that. Then when I moved to the US, I was fundraising for the American Cancer Society. I then became the head coach of the Philadelphia branch, running marathons and half marathons, but importantly coaching others. To the UK, I thought, let's me take on different challenges. Again, with Macmillan, I did triathlon, half Ironman, and then Hyrox is slightly different because you don't just have the cardio element, there's a big strength element to it as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I appreciate your willingness to give back. And I actually think it's a really interesting insight in terms of people that actually have cancers. Like you, unfortunately, my mother passed away from cancer, unfortunately, at a similar age. And I remember her going through the cancer process. And I think for someone that hasn't, fortunately, I hope most people don't have to experience this with someone they care about. But unfortunately, having experienced this, you get an insight of something you wouldn't really know unless someone you know had gone through that. And I actually found a lot of the doctors and people that she met were quite harsh. For a lot of the doctors' own mental health, you've got to be quite brutal about like, this is the diagnosis, this is what happens, because they've got to be able to be professional and focus on their roles instead of being like an emotional support person. Whereas I found for my mum, less so in the actually trying to beat it, which would be more focused on Macmillan and helping them when they have it, but more focused on like the end of her life, hospice for our family. They were like the nicest and most kind people ever. And so I can very much sympathize with you in trying to raise money for people actually in the journey because it's such a tough period of time in people's lives.
And you're also right, Harvey, about so many people being affected by cancer. So initially when I'm fundraising, I might be a bit sheepish, thinking, well, I'm asking people for money. And I'm particularly sheepish because I do these races often. And so my former colleagues, I must be one of the most expensive colleagues or PhD advisees because I'm always tagging them up for money every few years. But then I realised that this other professor might be a cancer survivor, or another professor might not be a survivor himself or herself, but were affected by family history. So it is something which does really unite. I wish it wouldn't unite people, but because so many people are affected by it, just you and me right now, it is something which rallies a lot of people around. So all the people who donated. I really appreciate. There were some people who were not able to donate for financial reasons. That's completely fine, but they would still send me messages of support or just like my LinkedIn posts, and so it's good to know that I'm running for a cause that many people care about.
I think for me, having lost a parent so young, I think being a kid, you kind of have this childlike innocence, thinking that the world is this thing, it's kind of like Disney World, always perfectly ending films where life just goes on. But I think losing a parent gives you this sense of realism to know that life is only this short. So hopefully I live way past my mum, but my mum passed away at 50 years old, I'm 21. And so to live the same amount of life as my mum, I'd only have 29 years of living. I know that seems like a very scary thing to think about, but it kind of gives me a sense of urgency to want to achieve great things. I mean, looking at your own career, having gone to Wharton, Morgan Stanley, working at London Business School, PhD from MIT, I mean, all of these absolutely incredible things. Do you think you also felt this sort of urge to want to achieve great things because of the passing of your father?
I think I'm just lucky to have been given gifts and opportunities. So I was the first in my family ever to go to university, which might seem unusual given my career is very academic right now, but he and my mum sacrificed in order to get me to school. So while I managed to get a scholarship to St Paul's, there was still even something like the bus fare. So the boarding for me to have boarded would have been too much of a financial cost. So I lived in Reading and I had to commute each morning to London. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, but something just like a bus fare, which might be to normal people something you don't think about, that was still something they'd have to sacrifice for. And that does make me happy with all the opportunities that I have, and it does give me a responsibility to try to use the education that I had, and it's not just education formally, but all the experience that they had, and pass them on to a lot of other people. So unusually for a finance professor, I try not to just teach finance to my students. So I think, yes, that's my job description, it's to teach the weighted average cost of capital. But I think, well, my career or my vocation is to teach them useful skills in life. And fitness is something that I indeed instill in them. I've been lucky to have had these opportunities in London and also in many cities in the US. There is a brutal gym called Barry's Boot Camp, and I am a regular at this gym. I've done over 1,000 classes, and so I have a nice arrangement with the gym that they allow me to take students who are first-timers free of charge. It's normally £26 for a single class, off limits to many students, but I take them, and this gives them a taste of health and fitness. And in particular, for many people who might be new to this and who might not normally think of going to a boot camp, but if their nerdy professor can go to this, then they can do it as well, and that gets them interested. Another thing that I have experienced is public speaking, and so I have that element to my class as well. And I think my job is a privilege because I get to pass on different types of advice to my students. Yes, I don't want to neglect the day job. They need to be able to pass their exams. And you don't want to stray from your lane and think of yourself as a guru who just dispenses any type of advice. But if it's something I have expertise in, such as fitness or public speaking, I do like to pass that on to my students.
I mentioned an unfortunate commonality between you and I is the passing of a parent. And so both of us kind of mentioned this idea in which, having lost a parent, well, at least for me, I wouldn't have realised who would be the best people in the process. So you mentioned that instead of putting money towards researchers, you would put them more towards Macmillan, where they're actually helping people with cancer. Something that I haven't had experience with, I mean, my parents went to schools, they went to universities, is not being a first generation at a good school, good university, whatever it may be. What are some things that you think that people having gone to a good school or university wouldn't be able to appreciate if their parents have done the same?
Yeah, thanks for this, and it's great doing these podcasts because I get questions like yours, which I've never got before, never thought about before. And so the question, if I understand correctly, is what, from a background of a first generation student, it might give you. I think it might just be gratitude and also the importance of working hard. You need to fight for things and work for things. In order to get to St Paul's, I needed to get a scholarship, and at the time there were foundation scholarships which gave you 15% off the fee, which I don't think would have been enough for us. I had to win what was known as the John Collett Scholarship, which was one scholarship which paid 100% of the fee. And had I not won that scholarship, I might not have been able to go. And so I needed to work really hard, not just to get a scholarship, but to get that particular scholarship. And that idea of graft, I think, applies to many things. It applies to fitness, something like endurance. Why I started racing again, because my last races were half marathons I did just before COVID, is I've now got 2 young children, and I thought, well, I can take my son to these events, and he came to a half marathon I did in Richmond 3 months ago, and unfortunately because of traffic he didn't actually get to see me race, but when my wife arrived I'd already finished, but I could just take him and show him the finishing line. So why is that important? Because before the race, when I left that morning, he said, "Daddy, are you going to win the race?" But for him it's just whether you win or lose, that's what any game or competition is to a kid. And I said, no, I don't think I'm going to win. But then I showed him where every runner gets a medal at the end of they cross the finishing line. And so the moral I wanted to leave him with was that everybody finishes. It doesn't matter how fast or how slow, even if you are slow and walking, as long as you don't give up, as long as you keep continuing and walking forwards, you will get to the finish line eventually, and everybody gets the medal. And I think there might be a lesson in there somewhere. With a running race, you only see whoever you're supporting for like 5 seconds as they run past. With Hyrox, and for the listeners who don't know, there's running involved, but also some strength stations like a ski machine or a row machine. I saw people there with their supporters, and they can watch you for the entirety of that ski or that row. And while yesterday I hope would be one and done, and I would not do one again, I now want to do another one to take my children to it. And yes, I don't want to browbeat them and brainwash them and force them to go into sports themselves, but because I believe it's a festival of all the great things that you can do with your body, what you can achieve if you put your mind to something. I think this is something that I'd like him just to experience, and if he wants to end up getting involved himself later, then...
I think one of the most beautiful and unique things about being human beings compared to AI or technology is that human beings are so multifaceted. I mean, if you imagine a basketball player or a doctor or an actor, a lot of us may look at those people and think, oh, well, they're just really good at basketball or being a doctor or whatever it may be. But actually, they might have kids, they might have family, they might have work, they still have to go to sleep, they have to eat, they do whatever in their life. Whereas if you think about a piece of technology, it might just be a very singular thing that they do. And the reason I make that point is even within your current role at London Business School, you still talk about fitness, you talk about public speaking and all of these other things, is because these things compound and connect to each other to enable people to be better economists, business people, or whatever they may be. On that point, what do you think, aside from health and fitness, what do you think are some other key lessons or pieces of advice that you aim to instill, or at least offer to your students?
I think it's to push yourself outside your comfort zone and take risks. So university, and I think life in general, but university in particular, provides you with some amazing opportunities that if you don't try it, then you might not get that opportunity again. And if you try and you don't like it and you fail, that's fine, but it might be that you try something and you end up loving it. So St. Paul's, perhaps similar to Eton, the rowing is a big sport there, but the rowers were 6'4", the coxers were 5'4", and me at 5'10", I didn't do either. And then when I started Oxford, I played football, I played tennis sports, I never thought I would ever row. But then I was sports editor of the Oxford newspaper, and this showed me how important rowing was, and I thought, well, it'd be a shame to have gone through rowing 3 years at Oxford without having rowed, so I decided to do just one term. I thought I'd just do one term. Yeah, admittedly, part of it was just say, oh, I rowed at Oxford, just to tick it off my bucket list. But then I loved it, and I continued for all of the remaining 2 years there. I kept it on while I was at Morgan Stanley. I still did it when I was at Wharton, and that was something that I just tried and I loved, despite not feeling that I had any particular knack for it. And then with marathon running, I started doing a half marathon, and again, I thought that would be the only thing. Went to the marathon. I never thought I'd do something like Hyrox, which has a big strength element to it. Whereas I'm fine cardio, I don't have that. And it can also move just to other things. So it could be something like music. And so we often think, well, you are born with a particular talent. And yes, talent does play a role. But I think many things with coaching you'll be able to do. So some people might think, I don't have a singing voice, but that can be coached. It might be dancing. You might think, well, I have 2 left feet, and I think I'm particularly poor. But when I was in the US, actually salsa is relatively popular there, whereas I think in the UK it's mainly women who will dance, not so much men. But in the US, because that was something that both genders did, I started doing myself, and I tried. I really liked for many years. So try things, and if you don't like it, that is still useful information because you know that that's something not to spend your time into, but you might try something and find something that you love.
I think particularly as kids, we look at in any industry. I mean, I explained some of them before. These ideas of the end product and what people are like. But, you look at LeBron James, who's won, I think, like 4 NBA rings, one of the greatest basketball players of all time. And you're like, oh, wow, he's done such amazing things. It must be so hard to get to his point. And that's obviously true because there's only one LeBron James. But at the same time, I think people confuse being remarkable with complexity. I actually would, and please correct me if you think otherwise, I actually just think the end result is simplicity compounded consistently. Like, it's actually just by doing the simple things well. And so to your point with regard to starting an instrument or having 2 left feet and playing football or going to the gym or whatever it may be, it sounds simple and it sounds like anyone can do it. But it's when you do these things consistently, you will learn consistently, and these results will start very simple and basic, but compound to amazing things over time.
Just to have that consistency in all walks of life. So I believe it was Gandhi who said you cannot do good in one part of your life while doing bad in other parts of your life. Life is a homogeneous whole. So I think just to have good habits in everything, so to take everything you do seriously, that doesn't mean not having fun, but that means just being conscientious about it. So it could be something which clearly matters to you, such as a graded assignment at university, but also other things. So if you're organising a party for your friend, or if you are painting something or tidying something, or helping somebody out, just to take it seriously. So I believe Ben Francis, the CEO of Gymshark in the UK, one of his phrases is, excuse my language, give a shit. And I do think that is important. Yes, we know when to not overexert ourselves, and we know when to take certain things easy, but I think too many people are actually on the other side of that you might think, well, this doesn't matter. And I think these things do matter, and if you were on the mindset where, yes, I'm in the gym, and yes, it could be that I slack off, and it doesn't really matter what time I do this workout in, it's just a workout, it's not even a competition. But if you take that seriously, if you take even a non-graded assignment that it's just going to be check plus, check minus, take that seriously, then that just builds your general mindset. That means that you will push yourself to the best of your ability.
So you go from your parents now having gone to university, so first generation, but then you kind of collecting degrees like infinity stones. What made you want to keep going into academia and actually teach the next generation versus continuing down that route of the Morgan Stanley finance destination?
Well, actually, I initially did not want to at all. So I never even considered academia when I was an undergrad. So you respected your professors, but you respected them as academics. You didn't really want to be them, at least not me nor any of my friends. It wasn't that it was on my radar screen and then I chose investment banking instead. It was just never on my radar screen to begin with. I thought, do I become an investment banker or go into trading or go into law? And I always wanted to go into law, and I did my economics and management degree at university, always thinking I was going to do a law conversion course. But, and this is ironic given my future path, is I didn't want to study anymore. I couldn't even do 1 year of law conversion. I wanted to get out in the world and do work, and then I got into investment banking, and I had a great 2 years. So many people get beaten up a bit, and yes, I did have to work hard, but I got to work with great people like William, who did the London Marathon in the same year as me. But what I realised was that your effect, while it was very deep, it was also narrow. So the first deal I worked on was for Abbey National, a UK bank at the time. I spent 7 months working on a sale. And the next day after the sale, it hit the front page of the Financial Times. It felt fantastic. But then the day after, the Financial Times had moved on to something else, and I thought, well, I've spent 7 months of my life working on one deal for one particular company, whereas I looked at what the people within Morgan Stanley research were presenting, and those would be some research notes about whether to invest in stocks or bonds or the US or Europe, and that was something which could be read by many. But even that was something which would be only true and only relevant for maybe a few days or a week. And then I thought back to the academic papers that I'd read at university, and they were timeless. So even in the 2000s, the turn of the millennium, which is when I was at university, we were reading stuff written 20 or 30 years ago, and those were things which still have relevance decades afterwards. And so that's what led me to try academia. So I went to MIT as a Fulbright Scholar to do a PhD in finance.
So it was almost a wish to be noticed for contributing great work So the deal, you put months into it, you get one day of reward. Whereas academia, there's a sense of timelessness to it.
So I think, and I know it might be easy for me to say, I genuinely don't think it was so much for me to get noticed or for me to get the credit as in to have an impact irrespective of who gets the credit. So just to know that your work is out there and it's changing the way that people think. So sometimes I will see my work referenced in newspaper articles. They don't mention my name, they'll just mention a study. And that's fine, even though they don't give me credit. If they realise, if they say, oh, well, there's a positive link between employee wealth and company performance, they don't need to credit me. I can see that my ideas have impact. I think it's the idea of making a difference. If I'm not afraid to get too meta about it, maybe the same sort of mindset which leads me to wanting to do things like endurance events. I want to do things with long-lasting impact, and some research that you do might have impact many, many years after you did it, even maybe after you're gone from this earth.
How do you go about navigating the difference in academia with a more focus for many things on the theoretical side of things versus the real world, sometimes brutal, complex, inability to predict what things happen?
This has been a struggle of mine, and one that I'm probably still struggling with and I haven't fully perfected. So in academia, so when you start, you focus entirely on academic research. So even if your goal at the end of the day is to have some practitioner policy impact, which is what I spend some time doing right now, when you're a junior, you have to absolutely focus on research. Why? Because you want to get tenure. And so what is tenure for those outside of the system is that after a period of time, so it might be 6 years at Wharton, it was 10 at Harvard, then you get evaluated for tenure. And what this means is if you get tenure, you get a job for life from which you can never be fired. Or if you don't get tenure, you're out. So it is very binary, it is up or out. And so you need to make sure that your research is strong enough and significant enough and impactful enough to get tenure, otherwise you have to leave. So all your incentives to focus on research, and that is what I did. And with research, you want to get 100% of the answer in 3 years, whereas in the real world, you might want to get 90% of the answer in 3 months. And at Wharton, you come up for tenure after 6 years, and even though you might have published maybe 7 or 10 papers within that time, you have to choose 3 papers, just 3, which are your signature papers, and you are evaluated mainly on those 3. So they want 3 home runs, not many medium-sized impactful papers. And so your incentives are to really be perfectionist, pay attention to every single word, how it lands, and to make sure it's absolutely. And yes, that should carry to the real world as well. And as I mentioned, you want to give a shit and to be conscientious and to write precisely for the real world. But I also realise that maybe I don't have time to get 100% of the answer. Maybe some of these issues are timely issues and I should know where to stop. And then if I'm stopping at 90%, then I should not claim definitive proof. I should just say suggestive evidence, but know where to stop and know that sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. And if what I have ended up with is only good, then make sure I sell it as good and don't pretend it's perfect.
That's a really interesting perspective. I'd never realised, because obviously you look at all these universities and see the amount of unbelievable output they're doing and what they're contributing to the world. But I didn't realise that there were actual incentives built into, you need the tenure within 6 years at Wharton or you're out, or 10 years at Harvard or you're out. I have found, so when I first came to Duke, I initially started studying economics. I actually do sociology now. And for me, I'm not an academic. I mean, my grades are obviously good enough to go to Eton and go to Duke and do great things. But going to university for me was more about how can I make the most of the academics and the experience, but more so, how can I build this podcast? How can I build up rugby at the university? How can I join the business club? How can I get a good job afterwards? So more of both the environment to make the most of it, but also a stepping stone to what's next, rather than just where I feel like more of the UK universities, particularly Oxbridge, are pretty much just focused on the academics. I feel like America's more focused on the whole you. With that being said, when I did economics at Duke, I found that a lot of the professors were less focused on the actual learning of the students and more focused on just do the lecture, I need to go and write my paper or whatever I'm doing. Versus sociology, what I'm doing now, maybe it's actually less about the material itself, but actually it's smaller class sizes. The teachers are genuinely interested in what I'm learning. If I'm doing well, we all make mistakes, right? So it's good to be able to learn from the teachers, whereas the economics is a bit more disconnected. So on that point, How do you think professors can go about, they've got that 6 or 10 year deadline where they've got to publish these papers, which their whole career is kind of on the line for, but at the same time, spend a lot of time with the students so that the students actually learn instead of being expected just to do everything themselves?
So unfortunately, one of the sad secrets of academia is that tenure is almost exclusively based on research and it's not based on teaching. So if teaching was really bad, sort of so bad that the dean ended up getting complaints, then teaching could be a problem. But the difference between mediocre or a little bit less than mediocre and excellent is pretty much zero. So it's research where all of the incentives lie. So and indeed, on my first day as an assistant professor, you met the deputy dean and he mentioned the tenure standards. And I asked him, what weight do you put on teaching in tenure? And he said 0. And while I was about to be crestfallen, he then corrected himself and he said 0 or negative. And so why did he mention it could be negative? Is if you are winning teaching awards, people might think that you are serious enough about research. Just like if you're really good at sports, people might think that you're not a serious academic. Or maybe the other way around, if I'm great at science, maybe I'm not good at sports as well. And so this is sadly the hard truth about it. And how do we change it? I think it is really difficult because of how ingrained this is in the system. So how is tenure given? It's given by, you're voted by your peers. So if you're a Duke economics professor, it's the rest of the Duke economics department. And so they benefit from your research. They're not taught by you. So if you're a good or bad teacher, it doesn't matter. Only if you're such a bad teacher that the department gets some problems is it an issue. And also, when you come up for tenure, then the Duke Economics Department will ask top economists at Stanford and Harvard and Penn and Columbia, what do you think of that person's research? And they will only comment on that person's research, not his or her teaching, which they'll know nothing about. So, a few years ago, I was invited to give a keynote speech to the Financial Management Association, which is one of the big professional bodies of finance professors. And normally when you're invited to give a keynote, this is an opportunity for you to showcase your own work. It might not just be one of your papers, maybe your whole body of research, because this is a great stage. I chose to do something a bit unusual. Rather than speaking about my own research, I gave a talk called The Purpose of a Finance Professor. Now, immediately, the title of that talk might put people off, because something like that might seem preachy. It might seem like you have made it and you're telling all of the less successful people how to make it in the future. And I said I had to get the tone right and say, well, this is not why I'm giving the talk. If you look at me compared to all of the other past keynote speakers, many of them have achieved far more things than me. So why I'm giving you this talk is these are things that I'm struggling with myself. And I talked about, well, why do we do this job? Yes, the vocation, the job description is to focus on research, but this is a fantastic job in which you get to teach the future leaders of this world, be this at Duke or Wharton or London Business School. And I just talked about how fun teaching is, how impactful teaching is, how much of a difference you can make. So we also think with research, we make an impact. Yes, it gets cited in a newspaper, but the average paper in the Journal of Finance, which is the top journal in the profession, gets 2 citations per year. 2. That means 2 of the papers reference your work. Whereas with teaching, I have just taught 900 students. I've taught 600 in one programme and 300 in and that just gives you a much greater ability to have an effect. And yes, it may not have career outcomes for me, but if all I want to do was to maximise my income, I would not have become a finance professor to begin with. The fact that we go into academia means that we want to contribute to something more than just financial wealth, and often we can lose sight of that because this publish or perish mantra is so narrow. And I wanted to get my fellow finance professors to think more broadly and think about, well, what a great opportunity this is to be able to interact with the students and teach the future leaders of this world.
I think that's a really good way of dissecting it. But I think the problem is that it's less of a focus on how good the teacher is and more of a structural, the disincentive is. I mean, you probably know economics better than me, but it's kind of like the teacher's alignment is fully focused on how good their work is, where actually the students are more focused on what can they learn, which is actually not incentivized by how the teachers do things. What do you think could or should be put in place by universities to not only focus on them getting the best research out there, but also to enable the best teaching of their students? Because I would argue that the top 10, 50, even maybe 90% of kids at these top schools in particular, let alone the schools that aren't ranked as high, those bottom 10% are going to struggle, right? Like maybe most people will go on and it's the star alumni that will achieve great things, but the bottom 10% of these top universities and maybe 50 or 60% of universities that aren't as strong are going to struggle with the learning, particularly when the teaching isn't as strong.
I think it's a few things. I think there's extrinsic incentives and there's intrinsic incentives. So I think in terms of extrinsic incentives, you could, like, if I was to wave a magic wand, I would change the tenure system and I would put significant weight on teaching. Why? Students are our clients who pay our salaries. So if I was at Morgan Stanley and my promotion from analyst to associate or to VP would have been independent of what my clients thought of me, that would make no sense at all, whereas you are our clients, and so I think that's something that should feed in. I think there are smaller extrinsic incentives, which are partly extrinsic and partly intrinsic, and what do I mean by that? You get teaching awards. Wharton, you get an award, which is a plaque, which is given at this big ceremony, and even though the plaque makes no difference, it's really the fact that Wharton cared so much that they wanted to give you this award. And the awards were not just for the highest ratings. There is an award known as Tough But We'll Thank You in 5 years' time. And why is that so important? Because that suggests they don't just want the awards to be given to the professors who were entertaining. They were given to people who were really challenging their students. There was also an award for goes above and beyond the call of duty, and that might be trying to teach other things beyond just the syllabus material. And that was also the case similarly at London Business School when I started, in that the best teacher won an award which was given out at the students' graduation, and the students would appoint one person to give a 2 or 3 minute speech about why they really value your class and why you were getting that award. And that had no monetary value, but it was really touching to do that. And that has been scrapped, and that's not something which costs the school anything, but they've just chosen to scrap it. And the award is not even a plaque, it's some rolled up piece of paper. They used to give a £1,000 bonus, and £1,000 is very small given the other things that you can do with your time, but it was something which, despite being small, it wasn't for the money, but the fact that the school cared so much about teaching that they'll give this token award, that has also been scrapped. And just these things, I think, suggest, well, more generally, does the school care about teaching or not? And I think small extrinsic things will intrinsically show what the culture is, and it's often the intrinsic motivation which matters. And then let me then take you to the intrinsic motivation, because we spoke about how your attitude in fitness might translate into your attitude to many other things in life. And this, to me, might be one of the intrinsic benefits of teaching. So yes, it is true that you are evaluated for tenure exclusively based on your research. But what does it take to be a great teacher? Is you need to explain complex things in simple language and make them engaging. And that is really important for a great researcher. So even though, yes, your research is read by other professors who you might think are really smart, why do they need things explained in a simple way? They may well be in completely different fields to you. So each professor has their own little niche, and to be impactful, it has to be that your research is recognised by the finance profession more broadly, not just in this small subfield. And so the same ability to make your work interesting and relevant and exciting to students is, I think, also something which translates into research. And some of the best researchers I know are also ones who are fantastic teachers. One of my advisors at MIT, Dirk Genter, won Teacher of the Year. See him presenting an academic seminar, he will be masterful. Steve Kaplan at Chicago, who's known for being an exceptional teacher, also a great researcher. So I do think there's a lot of overlap.
So we've spoken a lot about athletics and how that transfers to the other parts of your life. We've spoken a lot about the focus on teaching. You've put out a lot of things on LinkedIn. You've done public speaking, you've done a TED Talk, and made both your research and opinions very known. I thought it'd be interesting to go through a few of the topics that you had shared recently, and we could discuss them a little bit. So an article from a few days ago, you talked about the correlation, but not causation, between diversity and performance. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that.
So diversity has become a very topical issue right now. For a number of reasons. So some people think that diversity is a human rights or societal issue, is that there are particular groups who have been historically underrepresented and actively discriminated against. And so some may see, well, there's a social or moral objective to increase the representation of underrepresented groups. But interestingly, there are also many people who claim that there is a business justification. The argument is that financial performance of a business will go up if you have a more diverse group of people. And the logic seems really persuasive, is that different people think differently, and so if we had both men and women and whites and non-whites, we're going to get a variety of perspectives, and that will lead to just a greater set of ideas. And that is compelling. But, well, where do these different perspectives come from? It doesn't just come from gender and ethnicity. And so the idea of let's reduce diversity to just demographic diversity gives the impression that if you're a white male, you can never add to the diversity of an organisation. Even if you are British born and in an American university, that doesn't count, even though you've got obviously very different perspectives to your flavoured classmates. And so when I looked at the research by the likes of McKinsey and other consultancies, which are suggesting that outcome, actually that research is much weaker than what you might think, and the correlations go away when you look at them more carefully. But I wanted to not just be destructive, but also be constructive. And so some of my own research suggests that when you look at cognitive diversity, not just demographic diversity, and that comes from not just men versus women, but having different backgrounds at university, studying sociology versus engineering versus economics, that's something that can add value. And also if you think about the EI, in DEI, equity and inclusion, are we developing cultures where people can share different perspectives and disagree with each other, and that is positively linked to performance. And so what I've tried to do, and this is what I do I think on a lot of these issues, I might take some hot button issues, and this is not because I deliberately want to be controversial, but sometimes with hot button issues, why you only see one side is it's difficult to say the other side without being cancelled, and I want to present a different viewpoint, not because I'm anti-DEI, I'm actually pro-DEI, but I want to say, well, if you look at DEI in a more holistic way, you get even better results than if you were to narrow it down to just these two characteristics.
I saw something earlier, it might have even been something that you said, where it was essentially saying that if you believe, I think, it was something that you said from your TED Talk, it was essentially saying that if you believe something to be true, you've got to look at the contrary view, because that either strengthens it or it gets rid of it. But it's only by looking at the contrary view that you can strengthen it, and most people won't want to because of their own confirmation bias. I would actually go a step further with your point on diversity and performance, just as you said, with regard to cancel culture, that I think a lot of the incentives aren't built around what is the most efficient or what brings the most shareholder value or even happiness for people in the business is not from DEI, but rather it's more of a political thing that has kind of been put on other things. On top of that, if you were to bucket all poor people or all rich people, all of one race together, it completely gets rid of the uniqueness that we all share that makes us amazing. So for myself, for example, obviously I'm British born, I'm in America, I'm also neurodiverse, I have ADHD. But even with other people with ADHD, I can completely agree or completely disagree with them. And so I think that as human beings, we love to bucket people into categories, but we're so unique and so differentiated that makes us brilliant. But it also means that just by looking at arbitrary things such as the colour of our skin or the country we were born in aren't good enough things to even make diversity intellectually within a business.
I completely agree with you. And let me just then examine the other side. So how would people push back to us? Is they might say, well, Harvey or Alex, you're absolutely right. We want to look at diversity holistically, but it's really difficult to measure. So how are you going to measure whether you're optimistic or pessimistic or big picture versus detail? Can't we use something like demographics as a proxy? So it might not be perfect, but going back to my earlier point, perfect might be the enemy of good. Is not race and gender good enough? And that's indeed what many people have thought. Is I don't think they were as narrow as thinking it's the only thing that matters, but they thought, well, maybe this captures 60-70% of the variation. But what my research suggests is it doesn't. Is that it's not even a weak proxy. So there are so many other aspects of a person that if you were just to whittle it down to those characteristics, it's not that you're capturing 20%, you're virtually not capturing anything at all. And I think part of the reason is these other characteristics, but also part is, as you say, there's so much heterogeneity even within a bucket. So if I was to join the board of directors, am I there to provide the Asian view? No, that would be quite patronising. So different Asians think differently. So China's not the same as Singapore or Korea, and I've never lived in any of those countries. And would a woman be there to provide the woman's view? I think that would be quite sexist to claim that's why we want a woman on a board. She will provide her view, and some of that may be because women think differently from men. There is psychological evidence that they may be more cautious and have greater emotional intelligence, but that woman will have so many other aspects of her background which are relevant and she can bring to bear on whatever issues are being discussed.
I would argue that it's almost like there's a minimum level of necessity that needs to be implemented in which you remove racism, remove sexism, xenophobia, the whole list that stops people from contributing their true ideas. Because I just as much as anyone have been in environments where being British isn't liked in that environment, or I'm sure that, my girlfriend has been in situations where her perspective as a female isn't promoted or allowed to be as equal as other people. And the same thing with race. If I was to go, to some country, I won't name any, but if I was to go to some country, my view may not be seen as smart as some others simply because of the colour of my skin. And I think it's the problem we have is people equate the two. I would argue it's a minimum threshold where you can promote equality in a business by doing whatever it may be. And then beyond that point, in terms of getting growth, in terms of the direction of your business or enterprise, that is differentiated. It's the thing that gets you from 0 to 1 is not the same thing that gets you from 1 to 100.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really important to distinguish between these two. So absolutely, part of DEI should be non-discrimination and remove things which are either overt or more covert barriers that may well be that no matter what you say about equality, if a woman says something, then subconsciously you will put less weight in it than if a man said something. Or if there was a Asian person, you might think, well, they're not likely to be as good business leaders as a white person. So maybe they're good at the numbers, but they're not good at strategy or public speaking. So part of it is to remove that. But then beyond those barriers, which are real, and we do have our subjective biases, which are based on easily observable superficial things like gender and race, then when we want to think about who to hire, yes, we don't just want to hire the best person individually, we want the best person who contributes to the team, but what that person contributes can be in so many dimensions, not just their gender and ethnicity, and we want to make sure that we put all of these things into the mix when making a hiring decision.
Despite you being interested in a lot of different areas, and we'll touch on these now, I think the common thread is your emphasis and key focus on finding information that is real and information that isn't just down to confirmation bias, but rather is differentiated, unique, evidenced, and being able to consider both points of view. So something that you brought up quite recently was Rachel Reeves. I mean, we spoke a little about this before the podcast with regard to chess rankings. It'd both be helpful for you to explain what happened, but also to put that into perspective of not just her. I personally don't want to just pick on her, but why telling the truth and finding verified information matters.
Yeah, so Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, and then when she became Shadow Chancellor, I believe 2 years ago, there were many articles about her being a very good chess player, which I was delighted to see because I played chess when I was young, and I think this is something which teaches a lot of really useful skills for later in life. I'd actually never heard of her, I couldn't remember ever playing with her, and then when I looked at all my past tournament archives, I saw there was only one tournament that we played in together, even though she's only 1 year above me. But her ability didn't really matter. What mattered was that she's somebody who's out there promoting chess, and she plays chess against young children, which is great. She's now allocated some money towards the promotion of chess in schools, and this is all fantastic. But then there was a quote from her, which was that I was British Girls Under 14 champion. And that surprised me because I knew all the top females, and I always played in the British Championship, and the British Girls Champion was always given to the top girl at the British Championship. There was no separate championship, in the same way that the London Marathon, the men and women run the same race. And so this was odd, but I didn't say anything about it at the time, because I thought, okay, maybe people make slips here. And then, since then, there have been many other things which seem to have been slips, such as the claim that she was at the Bank of England for 10 years, when it was actually for 6, or that she was an economist at HBOS, which is a large UK bank, when I think the claim was that she worked in customer services. And then more recently, and what was the main trigger, was that she claimed she had to raise taxes a lot because of this big black hole in terms of the UK's finances, and that now there's allegations that that was significantly misrepresented. So I thought, well, this is, okay, if it's only one thing in isolation, I don't want to be nitpicking about this particular issue, but if it's a particular pattern of behaviour, it does matter. And so I wrote a post which I never thought would have get as much attention as it did, just to say, well, the chess champion in that year was a different woman, Emily Howard. This tournament that she played in, she came joint 26th out of 34. This was won by something else. And this news actually had come out, I think, about a year ago on various websites and major newspapers, but it didn't get much attention back then. But maybe because I'm someone who actually played chess and I'd looked up all the records, so it wasn't just an allegation, it did get picked up. And so what some people, let's always try and consider what the other viewpoint, is some people said, oh, well, she did win a different competition. She won something called the British Women's Chess Association competition, so it's fine, this is just semantics, you're being nitpicking, you're being too much of an academic. But these are completely different competitions. So one of them was the major competition which all the top players were at. And this minor competition was one which had, I think, 28 players at. She won the under 14, but they actually had 7 different age groups together all in one competition. In fact, 28 divided by 7 is 4, so there might have been 4 people in her category, and actually 4 people shared the title. And none of the winners of the British Championship were at that small event. And so the issue is not, should you be assessed according to whether you're a good chess player or not, but the issue is, well, if you make a claim, and you make the claim of British champion, that conveys a weight of authority. So it was that she said that she was West Yorkshire champion, when she was East Yorkshire champion. That didn't matter, because to the general public, there's no difference between the two. But if you say that you're the British champion at something, that conveys that you are the best in the UK. Just like if I won the US Open Tennis Championships, that is different from winning a US Tennis Championship. That is one particular event, and I thought it was useful just to correct the record. This is not to say that she's not a good chancer, this is not to say that she is a good chess player, but being British champion is something many people work really, really hard to get, and many other people work really hard and they don't get it. So I never won the British Championship. I won the 2 other main titles, but not the British. And this is the same rigour that I sometimes take with academic papers. There's sometimes people say, well, this paper was published when it wasn't, or people might claim to be a professor when they're a lecturer. They might claim the mantle of academic rigour when that's actually not fully earned. And I do think in a world of misinformation, we do want to be accurate. Now again, we don't want to go too far the other way and be unnecessarily pedantic. So there's some people who claim the Nobel Prize in Economics is not a Nobel Prize because it wasn't one of Alfred Nobel's original 5 prizes, and the actual official name is the Sverige Bank Prize in memory of Nobel. But that is just splitting hairs. It's given for the best person in economics, it is a Nobel. But this BWC Championship was nothing close to what the British Championship was, and I thought it useful to bring that to the record.
Yeah, I started to do these markets podcasts where every week talk about public markets, mostly around like equities, but very focused on stocks and current affairs versus what we're doing now, which is more focused on your story and life and can be listened to any point in time. So more like, really, really urgent and pressing issues. And a couple of months ago when I was discussing with one of my friends who was on it, Luke Sloman, we were discussing the 22 billion black hole and the tax rises, although a lot of people wouldn't want that to happen, it kind of seemed like a necessary thing that almost had to happen because, as we all know, you can't have a $22 billion black hole. And I think there was still some black hole, but I think it was 6 billion, which, is pretty much like a quarter of what the amount would have been. And whether it's chess or with this, I'm not really expressing my political opinion here, but the problem with when you're a politician is that you are representative of a nation, but also the morals that youth are supposed to use in their own lives. And so even though she may have made a mistake or not, I think it's using a mistake. I think you can make a mistake, apologize for it and move on. But I think making a mistake and then continuing on that and lying about it is a bigger problem. And it's not just Rachel Reeves that does this. This is a thing that global leaders all around the world do. And although it might drive clicks and drive votes, it's not a thing that builds a moral and reputable and honest population.
And this is why I wanted to speak out. So what I try to do is I want to pick my battles. I do my own research. I don't want to spend my time just sort of pointing things out. But I decide to speak out on issues in which I have knowledge and research. So this is why in diversity, my research is on that particular topic. And also being an ethnic minority, people know that this is not because of any political agenda. I think when the chess story originally came out way before me, it was on Guido Fawkes, which is a right-wing website, whereas I have no political affiliation. I voted for all three main political parties, Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem, in different elections. And I spoke on this because I was a former England junior chess player and know the difference between the tournaments and know that this is not just a semantic split hairing thing. These are very different tournaments, and so I wanted to get that across. And also, I think whenever you raise a concern about a politician, you will get flack and you might get pushback from sort of people who really support that viewpoint. But if you are seen as somebody who knows truth and stands up for stuff based on research and facts, you might be able to withstand the flack, and people might be more willing to listen to it than if you were somebody seen as more partisan.
You've also spoken quite a lot about the idea of ESG and corporate governance. Why do you think that's important? Do you think that this is, you kind of see these massive swings where it goes from every business in the world is doing ESG to not? I mean, even seeing in the US, under the Biden administration, there were many subsidies and promotion of electric vehicles and more of a push towards renewables, whereas under the Trump administration, he's taken away a lot of those subsidies and had more of a focus on oil and gas. So obviously this has kind of fluctuated over time. So I'd be curious of your interest on ESG, on social governance, and how your mind fluctuates when the rest of the world is changing their opinion on it.
This is a really interesting 20-year journey I've been on, but let me try and condense 20 years in just 1 or 2 minutes. So why did I get interested in ESG to begin with? So I did a PhD in finance, not in ESG. So a PhD in finance is to try to find what leads to financial success of companies. And I was at MIT, and MIT being MIT, all my classmates were looking at tangible factors, a lot of hard data, sales, profits, revenues, assets. But I'd just been at Morgan Stanley and I realised that the key asset was human capital. So workers were the most important. And even though this was a world in which monetary incentives were so high, how you're being treated, the corporate culture really made a difference. So I looked at the link between corporate culture, employee satisfaction, and long-term stock performance, and long story short, companies that treat their workers happier do better in the long term. Now, I never saw this as being ESG. I just saw this as being just human capital. But people said, well, this is an ESG paper because this shows that if you treat society well, and here society was defined as your employees, then the company does better in the long term. So you're not splitting the pie, giving part of shareholders' profits to workers. You're growing the pie, workers are becoming more productive and motivated and more likely to stay. And so that got me into what is now known as ESG more generally, but I always looked at it not from a societal perspective, but how can we improve companies' long-term success? And this is not because I only care about money and I don't care about society, but because companies do have responsibilities to their shareholders, and unless something is going to be value enhancing, it might be, despite the best will in the world, they're not at liberty to pursue it. And so for the first 10, 15 years of my career, it was persuading companies to take ESG more seriously, that it's not woke, it is a business issue. But then in the last 5 years, I think that the pendulum has swung too far the other way, where people sort of only care about ESG. So if you go back to diversity, when you hire somebody on the board, they look at, are they a minority or woman, not their actual credentials to do the job. If you are an asset manager and you're investing in companies, you're much more likely to be cancelled for investing in oil and gas or tobacco than you are in just to a poorly managed company. And so what I try to highlight is, yes, ESG does matter, but there's loads of other things that matter as well. So let's not put ESG on a pedestal and ignore all of these other things. And even if ESG is really good, there are diminishing returns, just like in any area of business. So it's not necessarily that we want to pay the workers more than any other competitors, or have the longest holidays, or the lowest carbon footprint. Those things all have a cost to it, and I want people to understand the trade-offs and the nuances that you see in any other areas of business, rather than things as being black or white, which is sometimes how ESG is perceived.
So How do you think that's more of your personal focus on it, but particularly towards the youth, but also to leaders of organizations, how do you think they should focus and think about ESG beyond simply the political dynamics of the time?
I think it's important to look at these as being long-term value enhancers for the business, which may transcend the political environment, because politicians will come and go, and yes, there will be certain things which do depend on the politicians. So whether there's subsidies for electric vehicles, that will clearly affect the returns to electric vehicle investment. But there are other things that are timeless, such as investing in your employees, creating a corporate culture where people can disagree with each other, finding best people, and that involves being blind to some of the covert discrimination that you and I talked earlier. Those are things which will survive. And so right now in the US, there are people thinking, oh, let's completely stop ESG because of the Trump administration. I think that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are many things which still make good business sense, which you do not want to necessarily roll back from. And actually, in a time in which all your competitors are pulling back from everything, if you focus and continue with the things which are truly value enhancing, then that is something which will pay off in the long term. You also mentioned to students and to young people, I think it's to view ESG with just a bit more balance. There's a lot of support for environmental issues and a lot of energy and enthusiasm among the young, but sometimes this might not be seeing particular trade-offs. We can't completely just stop oil, because there might be some 55-year-old coal workers or oil workers who can't easily retrain, they need these for jobs. And it might be easier for us in the UK or the US to say just stop oil, but in Africa, 600 million people have no access to electricity, and if indeed the way for electrification is partly through fossil fuels, that might be a price worth paying for economic development. So again, a lot of my work is trying to highlight some of these nuances and issues which are often seen as black and white.
I think the other problem that we have as a society, particularly in this social media and this more advanced technological era, is this convergence between what makes economic sense and what makes political sense. So, for example, ESG might often be focused on more of a left-wing policy and more focusing on just oil and gas, more right-wing, when actually there are benefits to both. So you point out a great example with regard to the 600 million in Africa that need the oil and gas, and that's not about left-wing or right-wing, it's more of a necessity. But then in the US and the UK right now, they might still need those things to provide for labour in other countries, but also within the UK and the US. But then they need to get towards renewables in the future due to the impending, the crisis with the environment. So it's the sort of the mix between the two. And I think as a society, we've got too focused on the black or white when things are actually much more nuanced than we make them appear to be.
I find this polarisation to be really odd, because Republicans say, well, we are the party of big business, therefore we want to focus on business and not these, quote, woke issues. But if indeed caring about the environment and being future fit in terms of renewable energy are things that enhance long-term company value, then any supporter of big business must take this seriously. So that was why my first book was called Grow the Pie. If you pay attention to these issues, you grow the pie benefiting not only society, but also long-term corporate profits as well. And so I try to take some of times these divisive issues, like DEI or ESG or climate change, and say, well, actually, properly implemented, these are things which can benefit all sides, and so to provide some middle ground between these two sides which would otherwise refuse to talk to each other.
What do you think is a question that you think about a lot, but you're not often asked enough?
Again, you ask, again, this is a great interview because you ask me so many things that I've never been asked before. What I always thought about. Maybe what still motivates me. Why? Because I have to admit, part of the reason why I wanted to go into academia is the ability for tenure means that you get early retirement. So if you have tenure, you can just choose to do nothing and just to enjoy life for the remaining however many years. And there are some faculty who do that, and by that I don't mean completely stop doing research or teaching. They might just do this but at a much slower level than in the past and enjoy life and take it easy. And for me, despite having other commitments such as my amateur athletic interests and my family, I still work pretty hard. And for me it is both having an impact, and so I will try to speak out about some of these difficult issues, even though, there might be risk that he's seen as an anti-DI person, but to speak out about them rationally and based on evidence in order to change people's minds. So sometimes the biggest praise you think you can give somebody is, I agree with everything that you said. But if so, you don't learn anything from hearing them. You don't come away learning anything new. And if people tell me, oh, I learned something new, I don't agree with everything you said, Alex, but I learned something I hadn't thought about before, that's of interest. And I think then that impact, that might seem altruistic, but then for me, selfishly, what motivates me is just being able to learn. And this is why my topics of interest might have changed from very narrow finance stuff to broader business things like DEI, and even things beyond business such as fitness or public speaking. And also learning different ways of conveying stuff to an audience. As I mentioned at the start, I focus purely on academic research. And maybe 90% of professors do that for their entire career. They focus on publishing papers, and that's great, they're contributing knowledge. Pretty soon after getting tenure, I decided to work a lot with practitioners and policymakers, and that was the challenge at the start. So in the US, you say you're a business school professor, you do get respected. So people understand, well, some of the best people, Michael Porter or Clayton Christensen at Harvard, they're seen as big authorities. If you're in the UK and you say you're a professor, people look at you as if you've got some kind of social problem. So you could have had a well-paid job in the city. The only reason you became a professor is that you just couldn't survive in the real world. So I had to highlight why research is not just an academic issue, why it has a lot to bring to bear on real-world issues. And it took me about 2 or 3 years of investment in that before people started taking me seriously. And part of it wasn't at their end, it was also at my end, is I need to make sure I can convey a message in a convincing and relevant way. And then now I write books for a more general audience, and those are books not just for business people, but for the general public, some of whom might have no interest in business. I want to show them how economics is actually fun and interesting. And I'm still learning about this all the time, and those are things which motivate me, is just always being able to learn new things. Maybe this was me moving from even marathons, half marathons to triathlons. I am a terrible swimmer. And then finally to Hyrox, where some of the brute force events like pushing a 152 kilo sled, those are things which are also new.
And I want to ask my final question, I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
With apologies for this one thing being a profanity, I do think the message of give a shit is valuable in all walks of life. So take things seriously. Many people have been given really unique gifts. And to use these gifts to make sure that whatever you do, you do well. It could be a non-graded assignment. It could be just to work out in the gym where you're just doing it for your own time. It's not something which goes recorded and or is even put on Strava. But to take things seriously. And taking things seriously doesn't mean not having fun. Sometimes actually taking things seriously means that you really enjoy it. So if you've done a big workout and you realise I've put everything into it and I'm just gasping at the end, that's fun. If I know that I've worked hard on this group assignment and pulled my weight rather than just left it to my teammates, that is something which is fun. If I'm sitting in a lecture and I'm not in my phone the whole time and I'm paying attention and I'm respecting whoever's speaking with that attention, I think that's something where I get something out of it more than if I was to be distracted. And also it shows respect, and also just leads to, I think, the whole class having energy and focus, because you caring and being conscientious rubs off a lot on other people.
When I do these interviews, I have kind of two contradicting ideas in my mind. On the one hand, I have the planned questions. You know, I spend hours researching online, watching interviews, reading things. And for you, that a lot of that is obviously with regard to your recent article about the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with regard to corporations and social governance and the environment, the books you've done, another recent article about diversity and performance and whether it's at least it's correlation or causation or whatever it may be, and everything else that you're doing in your life. And there's kind of these, like, that's the planned ideas that, you know, they're kind of repeatable, anyone can kind of ask it, and there's no differentiation from the interviewer's point of view, but things that I as an interviewer are still interested in nonetheless. But then there's the unplanned bits, which would be more about you going to Hyrox and the importance of fitness and sharing your own perspectives and views on the world, not just that's on the academic syllabus, even more to the point that within the university institutions, you're incentivized only to go about getting peer-reviewed research and publishing things rather than the abilities of your teaching. And it's funny because when we started this podcast and we started talking about more of the sport and how the impact that it has on life, I was thinking, at some point, I've got to talk about the planned things. And I actually found that the more that we talked about the unplanned things, the more emphasis we had on sport and the emphasis it has on life, the more that I felt like I learned, because it was not just focused on the segmentation of things you've already shared and the knowledge you put out to the world, but almost new knowledge through new questions, which I had from my own curiosity. So I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount. I feel honoured to have had you on the podcast today. I'm excited to interact with you and learn more of what you put out in the future. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Alex. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a huge pleasure for me as well, Harvey. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me on.